The fluorescent lights of Seattle General hummed their endless mechanical song, a sound Rachel Torres had learned to filter out 6 months ago, the same way she'd learned to make herself invisible. Temp nurse. That's all anyone needed to know. That's all anyone would ever know. She moved through the ER supply room with a kind of methodical precision that looked like simple restocking to the untrained eye, scanning expiration dates, rotating stock, assessing inventory with the same tactical efficiency she'd once applied to field hospital supplies in Ramadi. Her hands knew their job. Her hands had always known their job. The early shift stretched quiet, the kind of Tuesday morning when Seattle General's trauma bay sat empty and waiting. Rachel worked alone in the supply closet, her movements economical, nothing wasted. For bags in ascending order by fluid type. Chest tubes organized by diameter. Gauze packs arranged by weight like ammunition inventory, heaviest on the left. She reached for the top shelf, and her left side reminded her why she'd chosen temp work: no benefits questions, no background checks, no one asking about the limp or the scars visible along her collarbone when she wore short sleeves. The shrapnel had been extracted for years ago. The scarring was permanent. She touched the dog tag through her scrub pocket. Once per shift. Same ritual. The broken chain had been her son Marcus's. He'd given it to her before his first deployment, the insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines worn smooth by his fingers. She'd kept it when he came home, kept it when she'd rebuilt her entire life in the civilian world where no one asked questions about Bronze Stars or field hospitals or why a woman in her mid-50s moved through corridors like someone who'd spent 18 years reading rooms for threats. The ER doors opened, and Dr. Caldwell swept through like he owned the building, which, in his mind, he did. Chief of Emergency Medicine, board member's favorite, the kind of man whose voice made residents flinch before he'd even spoken. He was tall in the way wealthy men often were, shoulders back, chin elevated, a surgeon's hands that had learned to demand rather than request. Rachel watched him from the supply closet doorway without making eye contact. Caldwell never looked at temp nurses. Temp nurses weren't real doctors, real nurses, real people who mattered in his hierarchy. "I want these protocols tightened," Caldwell announced to the residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. Last week's pneumonia protocols were sloppy. Someone's going to kill a patient with sloppiness, and it won't be me taking the hit for it. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences. Board members protected people like Caldwell. Board members returned his calls. Rachel knew the type. She'd worked under men like him, men who'd never spent 11 hours holding a field hospital together while mortars fell outside the blast walls, who'd never had to decide which soldier got the last bag of blood because there wasn't enough for both. Those men knew something about consequence that Caldwell would never understand. She stepped back into the supply closet and continued her work. The other nurses had stopped trying to make small talk months ago. Rachel wasn't cold exactly. She just didn't participate in the gossip, the coffee breaks, the casual complaints about hours and schedules. She came, she did her job, she left. 6 months without anyone asking questions about her past, her background, her military ID that she'd never submitted because temp agencies didn't require the kind of documentation that would raise flags. Everything about her was designed to be forgettable. But her hands were wrong. That was the problem with pretending to be something you weren't. Her hands gave her away. They moved with the trained efficiency of someone who'd performed these tasks under pressure, for access on hypothermic patients with no usable veins, thoracostomy with improvised instruments, emergency resuscitation on concrete floors when the generators failed. The other nurses sometimes paused to watch her work, something unconscious in the way she organized equipment triggering recognition they couldn't quite name. Torres. Caldwell's voice cut through the supply room. He stood in the doorway, tablet in hand, expression already fixed in disapproval. "How long have you been with us?" 6 months, doctor." "And in those 6 months, have you considered pursuing actual nursing credentials, or is temp work your ceiling?" Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't tense her jaw. She simply continued organizing the chest tube tray in front of her, her movements unchanged. "Whatever the hospital needs, doctor." He made a sound like approval, though approval wasn't quite what it was. More like the satisfaction of a man who'd just confirmed his suspicion that everyone around him was beneath him. He left without another word, and Rachel exhaled once he was gone. The thing about control was that you had to give Caldwell something to feel superior about, or he'd take something worse. That was how men like him worked. They needed hierarchy the way other people needed oxygen. The dispatch radio crackled at 9:48 a.m. Rachel was restocking the trauma bay when the first call came through, the operator's voice cutting through the ER background noise like a knife through silk. Incoming trauma. Vehicle versus pedestrian. Multiple injuries. No identification on scene. Single dog tag recovered, military insignia, Army Ranger unit. Rachel's hand stilled. The 4-bag she was holding suddenly felt heavier, as if it had absorbed gravity itself. Army Ranger. That was Marcus's battalion, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the same unit insignia on the dog tag hanging in her locker, the same unit his commanding officer had led into Ramadi for the 3rd deployment. Captain Vance. The name came to her unbidden, muscle memory from letters Marcus had sent home, mentions of a CO who was solid, who kept his people alive, who came back with 8 soldiers under his command when some units came back with 4. Torres, we're setting up Trauma Bay 1. This from Nurse Jenkins, the day shift supervisor, moving past with the kind of purposeful energy that meant this was going to be busy. Incoming ETA is 7 minutes. Can you get the equipment staged? Yes. One word. Rachel moved, her body responding to the protocol even as her mind was 3 years away and 3,000 miles east, watching her son load a Chinook with desert dust still in his uniform. The dog tag in her locker suddenly felt like it was burning against her ribs, like it was calling to her through the walls and steel. She worked with mechanical precision, setting up the trauma bay exactly as it needed to be. Defibrillator pads. Intubation kit. 2 large-bore 4s on the cart. Fluid warmer prepped. Everything arranged so a team could move through the space like a choreographed dance, each person knowing where every instrument would be without looking. This was the work she was good at. This was the work she'd been born to do. The ambulance bay doors opened at 8:53 a.m. No, wait, that was wrong. She was remembering the timeline backward. The radio call had come at 9:08. The ETA was 7 minutes. So the ambulance was pulling up now, the stretcher emerging first, paramedics in blue moving with the controlled urgency of professionals who'd seen this 1,000 times. Rachel stepped back to let the trauma team take over, but not far enough. Not far enough to miss the details. The patient was unconscious. Male. Mid-50s. Head wound, left leg fracture, abrasion suggesting significant impact velocity. The paramedic was calling vitals, BP 118/76, heart rate 94, respiration 16, O2 sat 98 on room air, GCS 7, unresponsive. And then she saw it. The dog tag around his neck, hanging on a chain so mangled the metal was twisted like ribbon. The insignia was damaged but recognizable. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Her breath didn't catch. Her hands didn't shake. But something in her chest aligned, like a weapon being brought to ready position. Dr. Caldwell was already there, already in motion, already taking command of the space around him. Get him to imaging. I want CT head, cervical spine, chest, abdomen, pelvis. Labs, tox screen, and someone pull records if we get an ID. Doctor. It was Rachel's voice. Quiet. Calm. The same voice that had ordered transfusions under fire, that had called for morphine when there was no morphine left, that had kept 23 soldiers breathing when the generators failed. The blast pattern on his injuries, that's not consistent with vehicle impact. Caldwell's eyes found her across the trauma bay. The look he gave her was the kind reserved for people who'd forgotten their place in the hierarchy, who'd wandered out of their lane and needed correction. Temp nurse, he said, his voice carrying across the bay, across the entire shift, through the overhead speakers to every corner of the ER. The microphone on his collar amplified every syllable. Perhaps you could focus on changing bedpans instead of diagnosing my patients. Stick to what you're qualified to do." The room went quiet. Not silent, monitors still beeped, equipment still hummed, ventilators still wheezed their mechanical rhythm. But the human noise stopped. Conversations paused. Eyes found neutral ground. This was what happened when someone fell out of line. The group recalibrated around the new hierarchy. Rachel didn't respond. She watched as Captain Vance, and her mind was already confirming it was him, the angle of his jawline, the scar along his collarbone she remembered from a hospital visit 3 years ago, was wheeled toward imaging. She watched as Caldwell turned back to his residence, already moving on, already secure in his power. But as the trauma stretcher rounded the corner, Rachel caught sight of the chart. Captain James Vance. Army Ranger. Unit designation, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. And there it was, handwritten in the emergency contact line, emergency contact in case of injury, PFC markers Torres. Her son's name. Printed in blue pen on a hospital form by someone who'd found this information on a dog tag and thought it meant something official, something that would help the patient. Rachel stood in the trauma bay as it emptied around her, as the next crisis came through the doors, as the ER resumed its rhythm. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But the dog tag in her locker was calling to her now, not as a memory or a talisman, but as a prophecy. Captain Vance was awake somewhere in the hospital. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd led Marcus's unit through Ramadi. The man who'd come home and probably never thought about her, never knew that his junior enlisted's mother was 3 states away, restocking supply rooms, keeping her head down, keeping her past buried. But he was here now. And Rachel Torres was going to have to decide what to do about that. The supply closet was narrow, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast everything in sickly yellow. Caldwell blocked the doorway with his shoulders, his tie pulled loose, his face flushed with something that wasn't quite anger, it was something colder. Threat wrapped in a doctor's coat. "One more overstep and you're gone," he said, his voice low enough that only Rachel could hear it. "I have 3 board members on speed dial. You understand what that means." Rachel's hands were full of 4 bags. She didn't set them down. She didn't flinch. Her eyes met his with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, from having held dying soldiers in her arms in a field hospital under mortar fire while the concrete ceiling cracked and dust fell like snow. "Yes, doctor," she said. "I understand. You're replaceable. Every single one of you." He stepped closer, invading the space where patient files hung on shelves behind her. "The next time you question my diagnosis in front of staff, in front of patients, you'll be looking for work at a CVS. Are we clear?" Rachel set the 4 bags down slowly. Deliberately. When she looked up again, something in her expression had shifted, not anger, but a kind of clarity, as if she'd made a decision about something much larger than this moment. "Crystal clear, doctor," she said. He held the stare for 3 seconds. 4. Then he stepped back, satisfied, and left her alone with the fluorescent hum and the sharp smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the underlying copper scent of old blood on tile. The parking lot was crowded at shift change. 40 nurses and orderlies moving between the rows of cars under the sodium lights, their voices carrying across the asphalt. Rachel pushed through them, heading toward her vehicle, when Caldwell's voice cut through the chatter like a surgical blade. "Torres." She turned. He was standing near the ER entrance, his white coat still pristine despite the late hour, flanked by 3 residents who suddenly looked very interested in their shoes. "You're reassigned effective immediately," he announced, loud enough that conversation stopped. "Overnight janitorial duty. Starting tonight. Maybe mopping floors will be more your speed." The silence that followed wasn't dead air. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the wind moving through the parking lot, where you could hear someone's car alarm 3 streets over. Rachel stood still for a moment, not frozen, but processing, the way a soldier processes incoming fire and determines the best exit strategy. Then she walked. 20 pairs of eyes followed her to her car. No one spoke. No one moved. She opened the driver's side door, set her bag on the passenger seat, and paused for just a moment, her hand on the frame, her jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the force required to keep her composure intact. When she turned back toward the hospital, her face was perfectly composed. But a single tear had escaped, catching the sodium light for just a moment before she wiped it away without breaking stride. The gesture was so clean, so efficient, that it looked less like emotion and more like removing a spot of blood from her hands, practical, methodical, moving on. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She didn't argue. She simply changed into her maintenance uniform in the employee locker room and picked up the mop and bucket from the supply closet where Caldwell had cornered her less than 2 hours earlier. The smell of pine cleaner and water rose from the bucket like a small, bitter irony. The corridors of Seattle General changed at night. They became longer, hollower, the fluorescent lights buzzing their endless mechanical song in frequencies just below hearing. Rachel pushed the mop with the same precision she'd once used to set up triage stations in Ramadi, each stroke deliberate, each corner covered with military-level attention to detail. The water in the bucket darkened with each pass, the gray of accumulated dust and months of shoe traffic. 2 floors up, Captain Vance lay in the ICU, unconscious, the military dog tag on its broken chain resting on his hospital gown. She'd glimpsed it when they'd brought him through the ER, that single detail, that unit insignia that matched her son's battalion, the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. The battalion that had sent him overseas and brought him home intact because of officers like Vance. Officers who understood that keeping soldiers alive wasn't just about following protocol, it was about reading the room, understanding what the numbers meant, seeing the pattern before the system registered it. The mop squeaked against the tile. The bucket water sloshed. Rachel moved through the corridors in silence, and the dog tag stayed heavy in her thoughts, a small metal anchor tethering her to a part of her life she'd promised herself was behind her. At 1:16 a.m., she passed the ICU on her 3rd floor of the rotation. The glass walls of room for 12 were illuminated, and through them she could see the monitors, the familiar landscape of green and red lines that meant nothing to civilians but which she could read like a first language. Vance's oxygen saturation was dropping. The breathing pattern was wrong, shallow, compensatory, the kind of pattern you saw when something internal was collapsing. She stopped pushing the mop. 48 hours post-accident. Standard protocol. But Vance had 3 deployments in his file. 2 confirmed IED exposures. The symptoms Caldwell had dismissed as simple chest trauma, the shallow breathing, the guarded position, the way his body was protecting something deeper, those were the early warning signs of something that killed soldiers more effectively than bullets. Something that could cascade suddenly, turning a stable patient into a code without warning. Rachel's hands were shaking as she checked the chart. Not from fear. From recognition. From the terrible certainty that comes when you've seen this before, when your body remembers before your mind can fully process it. Caldwell had ordered standard protocols. Oxygen monitoring. Pain management. Nothing for what was actually happening inside Captain Vance's chest. She paged him. Professional, respectful, the voice of a janitor calling a doctor, Dr. Caldwell, this is Torres. Patient in 412 showing signs of delayed tension pneumothorax. Multiple IED exposures in his history. His O2 sat is declining and his breathing pattern suggests. What now, Torres? His voice was irritated, thick with sleep or something that made his words come slower than usual. The patient needs assessment. His vitals are trending toward. You're a janitor tonight. Stay in your lane. The line went dead. Rachel stood in the hallway with the mop in one hand and the phone in the other, and she did something she hadn't done in 6 months of being the temp nurse, in 6 months of burying her past and accepting humiliation and swallowing every instinct to lead, to know, to act on the certainty that comes from experience. She put the mop down. She set the phone down. And she calculated the timeline. If Caldwell didn't reassess. If the pneumothorax progressed the way she suspected. At 2:14 a.m., the code blue alarm screamed from room 412 like a siren cutting through everything else. Rachel heard it from 2 floors below, and she didn't hesitate. She dropped the mop. She moved. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Caldwell arrived in the trauma bay moving slow, moving like a man who'd been caught being wrong, and his hands were shaking as he reached for the chest tube kit. The laundry room smelled like bleach and hot cotton. Rachel stood at the folding table, her scrubs still warm from the industrial dryer, and she folded them with the same precision she'd once used to fold flags over the coffins of soldiers who didn't come home. Crease. Fold. Stack. Her hands moved through the motions without her mind directing them. The fabric was still damp enough to release steam into the fluorescent light above her head, and she watched it rise and dissipate like everything else she'd built in this new life. Gone. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway at 4:06 a.m. She didn't look up. She knew the sound of his breathing before she heard his footsteps, the shallow, satisfied breath of a man who'd just won something he'd been chasing. His arms were crossed. His posture was the physical manifestation of someone who believed the worst part of her punishment was already complete. He stood there for exactly 12 seconds without speaking. She counted them the way she'd once counted incoming rounds. "You're quite the cleaner, Torres," he said finally, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. Not a compliment. An insult wrapped in a word that almost sounded kind. She folded another scrub shirt. Military corners. Hospital corners. Perfect. Gone by end of shift, she said quietly. "I'll make sure the locker is clean." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd successfully erased someone from a place where they'd briefly mattered. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the tile in a rhythm that sounded like victory. She was alone in the laundry room with 7 more scrub sets to fold when the radio on her hip crackled. She'd kept it from her earlier shift, old habit, nobody had thought to take it back yet. The night supervisor's voice came through, tight and clipped, "All hands, ICU. Bed 7. Now." She didn't move. Not her patient. Not her floor. Not her job anymore. The radio crackled again. "All available staff to ICU. Rapid deterioration. Bed 7. ETA 2 minutes." Her hand stilled on the final scrub shirt. Bed 7. She'd wheeled Captain Vance to that bed herself, 16 hours ago. She'd noted the bruising pattern along his ribs, the way his breathing favored his right side, the subtle signs of internal trauma that Dr. Caldwell had dismissed with a single sentence spoken into an overhead page in front of the entire trauma floor. The hospital wasn't quiet at this hour. It had its own kind of sound, the ambient hum of machines keeping people alive in the dark, the distant percussion of monitors beeping their steady rhythms, the occasional squeak of a stretcher wheel somewhere 3 floors above her. But when she heard the first code call, the pitch of the attending physician's voice changed. It went from routine to emergency. It went from protocol to panic. She stood in the laundry room doorway, listening to the silence that followed the initial alert. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The dryer tumbled in the corner, indifferent. And somewhere in the ICU on the 3rd floor, a man whose commanding officer had kept her son alive through 11 months of desert deployment was crashing. Rachel made it to the stairs in 37 seconds. She knew this hospital's vertical geography the way she'd once known the layout of a field hospital in Ramadi, every door, every shortcut, every space where bodies could move quickly. The stairwell door slammed behind her with a metallic echo. Her feet on the concrete steps sounded like drums. 1 flight. 2 flights. The door to the 3rd floor burst open and she moved into the ICU corridor, where the air itself felt different. Charged. Electric with the specific kind of dread that came before death. The ICU's main station had 3 nurses clustered around monitors. The attending physician, a woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves, maybe 45, with the scarred hands of someone who'd been doing this for 2 decades, was already moving toward bed 7. Rachel heard the vital signs being called out before she saw the room. O2 sat 94 and dropping. 90. 88. The attending's voice came next, set up for chest decompression. Now. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Somebody get the chest tube kit. Rachel moved toward the room without permission. Without thinking. It was the same motion she'd made 1,000 times in Ramadi when the mortar fire came and the wounded flooded in, and there was no time for protocol, only for action. Only for survival. Captain Vance lay in the ICU bed with his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of someone whose lungs had betrayed him. His face was still bruised from the accident. The monitor above his head showed a heart rate of 147, climbing. The blood pressure had started to drop, 135/70 and falling. Falling. And the oxygen saturation continued its descent into a zone where cellular death began. 83. 81. 79. Dr. Caldwell rushed into the room from the opposite entrance, his coat still unbuttoned, his hair suggesting he'd only recently left his bed. His hands, when he reached for the instrument tray, were trembling visibly. Rachel watched his fingers fumble with the sterile wrapper. His jaw was clenched. His breath came in shallow draws. This was different from the confident man who'd humiliated her in the supply closet. This was a man who understood, in the moment of actual crisis, that strategic brilliance and institutional connections meant nothing when a human being's chest cavity was filling with blood and air. Oxygen saturation is 75, Dr. Reeve said, her voice steady as a metronome. Doctor, we need to decompress now. Caldwell reached for the scalpel. His hand shook. He dropped it. The metal clattered against the floor with a sound like a bell announcing failure. He bent to retrieve it, and the moment stretched, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds of precious time evaporating while Captain Vance's body began to shut down. Rachel was in the doorway. Technically not her patient. Technically not her job. Technically not even authorized to be standing in this room after what Caldwell had done. She could see the attending physician's eyes flick toward her, a question forming, a request forming, a hope forming that maybe someone else could do what the man holding the scalpel clearly could not. She's not authorized, Caldwell said, his voice cracking. He stood between the attending and Rachel like a barrier made of ego. Nobody but staff. Rachel's hand moved to her hip. The pocket on her scrubs where she kept the same thing she'd kept through 12 years of service. The small piece of metal that had traveled with her through deployment, through medical school, through this new life where no one knew what she'd been. An MRE wrapper. Mylar and plastic, the kind that came with the ration soldiers ate in the field. She'd kept one since deployment. Old habits. The kind of habit that saved lives when there was nothing else available. Captain Vance's monitor flatlined. The attending physician's eyes widened. The sound of that silence, the absence of the beeping that meant a human heart was still beating, was louder than any alarm. Caldwell froze completely. His hands dropped. He was a man who understood systems and politics, but he did not understand this. This moment where competence meant nothing. Rachel stepped into the room. She didn't ask. She didn't request. She moved like someone who'd made this exact motion 100 times before, in a field hospital in Ramadi, under mortar fire, with nothing but her hands and her training and the absolute knowledge that this man in front of her did not have enough time left to wait for permission. She improvised the chest seal with the MRE wrapper, muscle memory taking over, her hand steady as surgical instruments as she taped it to Captain Vance's chest wall in the three-point technique that allowed air to escape but prevented it from entering. The attending physician stared. The nurses at the station stopped moving. Caldwell's face twisted into an expression that contained rage and humiliation in equal measure. Then Rachel reached for the needle kit. Her movements were precise, each gesture controlled and economical. She located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She felt for the anatomical landmarks her body remembered. The needle went in with the particular resistance of air-filled lung cavity. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a pressure valve releasing. Captain Vance's monitor came back to life. First one beep. Then another. The rhythm reformed, irregular but present. 75 beats per minute. Climbing back toward survival. O2 sat 84, Dr. Reeves said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been shock. 87. 90. Climbing. Caldwell turned and walked out of the room without speaking. The ICU doors burst open and Rachel moved like current finding ground. The attending physician was already calling for crash cart, but the monitors screamed what everyone could see: Captain Vance's oxygen saturation dropping, 88, 84, 80, and his breathing had stopped entirely. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the chest cavity compressing the lungs, crushing the heart, killing him in real time while Caldwell stood frozen at the bedside with a 14-gauge needle trembling in his hands. Needle decompression, second intercostal space, the attending called out, but Caldwell didn't move. His hands shook like wind-bent saplings. The needle clattered to the floor. 47 seconds. That's how long Vance had before cardiac arrest became irreversible. Rachel saw the math the way she'd seen it 100 times in Ramadi, in the gap between breath and death, in the space where hesitation became murder. She didn't ask permission. She moved. Get me an MRE wrapper. Now. Her voice carried the weight of command, though her scrub still said temporary. The resident blinked, then ran. Rachel's hands were already working, already steady as surgical lasers, her fingers reading Vance's chest like braille, finding the landmarks she'd memorized in blood and trauma: second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the thin space between ribs where air was killing him. The resident returned with the wrapper, the plastic emergency chest seal she'd carried in her locker for 6 months, a habit from Ramadi that had no name in this hospital's protocols. Caldwell opened his mouth. Rachel didn't let him speak. 72 millimeters of tegaderm tape. Now. The needle went in. She felt it, heard it, the small resistance of skin, then the hiss. The hiss of air escaping. O2 climbing. 80, 84. 88. Vance's chest rose. His lungs filled. His body remembered how to breathe. Rachel sealed the wrapper over the needle site with movement so practiced they looked like choreography. 3-sided seal, leaving one edge open for air to escape but not return. The same technique she performed in field tents while mortars walked their way across the compound, while blood pooled on canvas stretchers, while her hands moved on their own because her mind had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury the dying couldn't afford. Breath sounds, she asked without looking up. The attending placed a stethoscope to Vance's left lung. His eyes widened. Bilateral. Clear. Sinus rhythm, the cardiac monitor sang out. Normal. Alive. Breathing. Because she moved. Because she didn't wait for permission that would never come. Rachel stepped back. Only then did she look at Caldwell. His face had gone the color of old paper. His hands hung at his sides like they'd forgotten their purpose. The attending physician stared at her, then at him, then back at her, trying to assemble the geometry of what he'd just witnessed, how a temp nurse who restocked supply rooms had just performed tactical medicine with the precision of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. "I'll document the procedure," Rachel said. She kept her voice flat, professional, though something had shifted in her chest the moment she stepped into that space. The mask had slipped. She'd revealed the thing she'd buried under temporary credentials and humility, that her hands still remembered Ramadi, that muscle memory was longer than any contract, that competence didn't ask permission to exist. Caldwell's jaw clenched. She saw him calculating, saw the anger beginning to build behind his eyes like pressure in a closed chamber. But he didn't speak. Not yet. The attending was already pulling up the ICU protocol on the computer, and 2 nurses were staring at Rachel with something between awe and recognition, as if they were seeing her for the first time. By 6 a.m., she'd already been fired. Caldwell had moved with surgical precision. 3 formal complaints, each one meticulous, unauthorized procedure, protocol violation, insubordination. He'd called the temp agency CEO before breakfast, they golfed together at Pinewood Country Club, had met there every Thursday for 7 years, which meant Rachel Torres never had a chance. She got the call in the break room. Her contract was terminated effective immediately. Caldwell himself escorted security to her locker, watching as she packed the cardboard box he provided. The MRE wrapper, still sealed in a biohazard bag. The photo of Marcus in dress uniform, 18 years old and serious-eyed and wearing the rank of second lieutenant because his mother had taught him what service meant. The single dog tag on a broken chain, Vance's, from last night, that he'd pressed into her hand when she checked on him at 5 a.m. and he'd finally opened his eyes. She'd saved his life, and he'd given her the only piece of himself he could carry on his body. Now it was folded in a paper towel in the bottom of the cardboard box. "You should have stayed invisible," Caldwell said. He stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, satisfied. The morning light through the locker room window made him look like he was carved from marble, cold, immobile, certain. Nobody needed a hero. All you had to do was change bedpans and keep your mouth shut. Rachel didn't respond. She just packed. Careful, methodical, the same way she'd packed field hospital equipment after each rotation. Everything had its place. Everything mattered. She'd learned that lesson in Ramadi when she was 28 years old and responsible for 15 beds, and a shell had come through the tent wall, and she'd learned that the difference between success and failure sometimes came down to whether you'd organized your supplies with intention. The laundry room at dawn had been worse than the locker room. That's where she'd folded her scrubs for the final time, the pale blue fabric still warm from the dryer, and she'd folded them with the same precision she'd once folded flags at Arlington, crisp corners, sharp creases, the kind of precise geometry that meant something. Behind her, Caldwell had stood in the doorway watching, and when he said, "You're done here," she'd just kept folding. One tear had escaped. She'd wiped it away without breaking stride, the way she'd learned to do on a desert compound 6 months into her first tour, when crying was a luxury and breathing was the job. Now the box was full. Now her temporary badge was revoked. Now she was walking out of Seattle General in Raleigh with 6 months of invisibility suddenly, catastrophically revoked. Because she'd saved a man's life using knowledge she wasn't supposed to have. Because her hands had remembered Ramadi. Because competence had a voice louder than any protocol, and she'd let it speak. The parking lot was still wet from last night's rain. Rachel sat in her car for 20 minutes without turning the key, just sitting with her hands on the steering wheel, watching the hospital's morning shift arrive, watching doctors and nurses in their fresh scrubs flow into the building like she'd never been there at all. By tonight, they'd have replaced her. By tomorrow, they'd have forgotten her. That's when Marcus's truck pulled up beside her. Her son's face was flushed, his hand shaking as he gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford F-150. Behind him on the passenger seat sat something she'd hidden in the attic for 6 years, the shadow box with its carefully arranged medals, its photographs, its military commendations laminated and preserved and labeled with dates and circumstances she'd never spoken aloud. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Captain Vance called me. He told me what happened. What you did." Rachel's chest tightened. "Marcus, no. He told me to tell you something. He said, tell your mother she's still in command. She just forgot for a while." Marcus held up the shadow box, and his eyes were fierce, bright with something between fury and pride. "They need to see these. The board needs to see them. He's in a meeting with Caldwell right now, and you need to walk in that room and show them who you are." "I can't do that." Rachel's voice came out small. Wrong. Not the voice that had commanded field hospitals or given orders under fire. The wrong voice. The temporary one. "You just saved his life using medicine they're not even teaching yet, Mom. You did that with your hands. You can do this with your words." Rachel looked at her son, 17 years old, already taller than her, already carrying the weight of knowing exactly what his mother was capable of, and she understood that some masks are meant to be broken. Some invisibility is meant to end. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." The parking lot was empty except for Rachel and her car. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause for a performance no one was supposed to see. She'd cleared out her locker an hour ago, 7 years of careful anonymity packed into one cardboard box that Caldwell had personally carried down, his smile sharp as broken glass. The scrubs she'd folded that morning at 4 o'clock, when the laundry room was just her and the machines, were already in a donation bin behind the hospital. She didn't look back. She never looked back. The shadow box came first. Marcus's tires skidded in the rain, his 17-year-old hands gripping the steering wheel like it might escape. He was breathless, running on the kind of adrenaline that only comes from finally understanding something that had been hidden your whole life. The shadow box was oak, glass-fronted, the kind of thing families mount on walls in houses where fathers came home from their last tour and stayed there. It had lived in Rachel's attic for 8 years, the one place she never made him look, never let him ask questions about. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Mom, I called Captain Vance's room. He told me what you did." Rachel turned. She was calm. This was the thing about people who'd held lives together under mortar fire. Rain didn't register as stress. The box was the thing that registered. The moment between before and after, made of wood and metal and glass. "Get back in the car," she said. "I'm not getting back in the car. Captain Vance said you saved his life. He said you did something nobody else in the hospital could do. He said," Marcus looked down at the shadow box in his hands, at the decorations visible through the glass, at the weight of what he was carrying. "He said you're Major Rachel Torres. He said you're the reason I'm still here. Because you kept his whole unit alive in Ramadi." The rain kept falling. It had a sound like small caliber rounds hitting water. "Marcus." "No. No more hiding." He was 18-year-old fury and 17-year-old confusion and something else underneath it all, something that looked like pride. "They fired you for saving someone's life. Caldwell fired you. And I'm going to tell them exactly who you are." He didn't wait for permission. He walked back into Seattle General through the emergency bay entrance, the same doors Rachel had limped through 8 years ago looking for a way to disappear. His uniform wasn't military, he was still high school, still 3 months from enlisting, but he moved like someone who'd inherited her composure. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they always did. Nothing changed. Everything changed. The executive conference room was on the 4th floor. Caldwell was already there with 3 board members, his laptop open, his presentation queued up. He'd prepared documents about protocol violations, about unauthorized procedures, about the liability of letting a temporary nursing assistant, someone with no discernible qualifications, intervene in critical patient care. His voice had that satisfied edge to it, the sound of a man who'd spent 2 hours on the phone calling in favors and now felt confident his problems were solved. The cardboard box of Rachel's belongings was visible on the credenza behind him, a prop in his narrative about order restored. Marcus pushed through the conference room doors without knocking. "My mother is Major Rachel Torres," he said, and his voice didn't crack this time. "And you just fired her for saving your patient's life." The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock, the kind that comes from the air pressure changing, like a door had opened to somewhere else. Caldwell's face shifted from satisfied to confused to red, color rising up his neck like tide. One of the board members, Harrison, according to the nameplate, reached forward for the shadow box with hands that trembled. He read the first citation aloud. "Bronze Star for Exceptional Valor Under Enemy Fire, 2007. Breath." A pause. The hospital attorney's face went white. "Bronze Star for Medical Innovation in Combat Conditions, 2008. Another pause. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed. "Purple Heart," Harrison continued. His voice had changed. It wasn't the voice of a hospital administrator anymore. It was the voice of someone who understood the weight of what he was holding. For injury sustained while treating wounded under active fire, Ramadi, Iraq, 2009. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every assumption that had been wrong, every moment Rachel had been underestimated, every time someone had looked at her and seen exactly what she'd wanted them to see, a quiet woman who knew her place, who didn't speak up, who changed bedpans and cleaned floors and asked permission to exist. Captain Vance appeared in a wheelchair in the doorway. His left arm was in a sling. His color was better than it had been 6 hours ago. O2 sat stable at 94%, heart rate steady, the ventilator already extubated. He rolled forward slowly, and the sound of the wheelchair on tile was the only noise in the room. Major Torres held a field hospital under mortar fire for 11 hours, he said, his voice clear and military precise. She had 47 casualties. Combat medics don't stop treating even when the walls are burning. She didn't lose a single soldier. He paused. She saved my life yesterday with nothing but muscle memory and the contents of an MRE packet. I watched her work. I was awake enough to understand what I was seeing. She performed a needle decompression in the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, while Dr. Caldwell stood frozen. That's not a protocol violation. That's what Major Torres does. The hospital attorney had already pulled up the redacted military file. Rachel's discharge papers. The commendation letters. The medical board certifying her in trauma surgery, tactical medicine, field medicine, emergency critical care. The security clearances. The everything, all of it, the entire life she'd spent 8 years hiding while she learned how to be invisible. One of the other board members turned to Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell, you filed 3 formal complaints against this woman, her credentials are beyond question. You called in favors to terminate her temp contract. You personally removed her from this building. The board member's voice wasn't angry. It was worse than anger. It was the sound of someone who'd understood that everything they'd just witnessed was premeditated. And then you attempted to delete the security footage from last night. Caldwell stood up. His mouth moved. Words came out, but they were the wrong words, something about protocols, about hierarchy, about unauthorized procedures. The FBI liaison arrived at exactly 4:02 p.m., stepping into the conference room with the same kind of calm that Captain Vance had brought. Federal investigation. Tampering with medical facility security footage. Mandatory review. The veteran IT director, a Marine with 23 years of service, had preserved every frame. Every single one. For 22 a.m., Caldwell in the security office, fingers on keyboard, requesting permanent deletion of ICU camera 3 footage. The timestamp. The request. The evidence. As a Marine, the IT director had told the FBI liaison, I recognized what that meant. Caldwell's face went from red to a color that didn't have a name. I'm suspended, he said. It wasn't a question anymore. Harrison stood up. His voice was steady. Effective immediately, Dr. Caldwell. Your access is revoked. An investigation will be conducted. Your board connections may have shielded you in the past, but not this time. Security arrived with another cardboard box, the same size as the one they'd taken from Rachel hours before. They packed Caldwell's personal effects with the kind of efficiency that suggested this had happened before, somewhere else, in some other conference room. His laptop. His photo frames. His nameplate. His diplomas. All of it going into the box while 4 board members watched and Captain Vance sat in a wheelchair with his arm in a sling and Marcus stood with his mother's decoration still in his hands. Caldwell passed Rachel on his way out of the building. They were in the parking lot, rain still falling, the kind of rain that washes everything clean and leaves nothing hidden. His face was red. His jaw was clenched so tight you could see the muscle working. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. His strategic network of allies had gone silent the moment the FBI liaison mentioned federal investigation. His institutional power had evaporated the moment someone proved he'd frozen in a crisis while a woman with no title saved a life anyway. Rachel took one measured breath as he passed. She didn't move. She didn't smile. She just watched him go, and her composure in that moment, that absolute, perfect stillness, was worth more than any title could ever be. 6 months later. Seattle General's Veterans Trauma Program occupied the entire 3rd floor. Rachel ran it. Her title was Director of Combat Medicine Integration, but what she actually did was take the things she'd learned in Ramadi, the things about what happens to bodies under stress, the things about how to think when your hands are covered in blood and the noise won't stop, and she taught civilian doctors how to save lives on the worst days those lives could have. Her office had two things on the wall. The first was the shadow box, mounted in dark wood and glass. The second was a frame with Marcus's commission certificate inside. He was in his dress uniform in the photograph, fresh from officer training, his shoulders back, his eyes clear. The single dog tag on a broken chain hung between them both, the one they'd recovered from the ER floor, the one that had started everything, the one that meant Captain Vance still visited monthly, consulted on patient care, stood in the trauma bay with a recovered arm and told stories about Major Rachel Torres to anyone who would listen. The IT director now headed hospital security. Captain Vance came in twice a month. The veteran nurses and Rachel had made sure the hiring board knew to look for them, to recognize them, to bring them home. They greeted Rachel with respect earned and given, not demanded. Marcus visited in his uniform. Rachel straightened his collar with the same hands that had once held field hospitals together under mortar fire. The attending physician approached her on the third floor. "Major, we have incoming. Ranger with blast trauma. I'd like you to take the lead." Rachel's limp was still visible as she walked to the trauma bay. The scar tissue under her scrub still pulled when the weather changed. The things that had been broken hadn't fully healed, they never did. But she was teaching now. She was standing in a room of civilian doctors, showing them how to think like combat medics, how to make decisions when time was measured in seconds, how to understand that pain was information and shock was a puzzle and sometimes you had to improvise your way to alive. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've ever been underestimated for who you really are, subscribe to our channel. Like if you think Rachel's quiet dignity was her greatest strength, that's what I'm asking you to choose. And comment, would you have done what Rachel did? Would you have saved him knowing the cost? What would you have sacrificed to be seen for who you really are?